Hello, and welcome to the beginning of Part 2 of the Marlborough Medieval Studies course. This will be Lecture 1, and we are going all the way back to the beginning. We got to the end, we talked about the 100 Years' War, we talked about kingship, and before that we talked about cities, we talked a little bit about feudalism. We made it all the way through the timeline from the end of Rome to the end of the 14th century, middle of the 15th century, and now we're going back all the way to the beginning. And today we are going to cover some of the same people that you will hopefully remember from Section 1, Lecture 1 on the end of Rome. We're going to get to Diocletian and we are going to get to Constantine, who are very important people the second time around as well. But we're going to introduce some new characters and we have a new focus. This time we are looking particularly at religion. For much of medieval history, Christianity, Catholicism in particular, but Christianity in general is obviously a major force. So that is going to be our general focus for this time, although we will talk about other religions and their role in the Christian community, but also their role as along the perimeter of the Christian community. Since we're talking about Christianity this time, instead of just going back to the 3rd century where we started last time, we're just going to go right back to the beginning, the year 0, since of course even this timeline is named for the events in the Christian past. Now, obviously, I don't need to explain to you why Christianity matters or why it's important both for medieval society and continuing today. In these 5 lectures, we're going to go from the beginnings of Western Catholicism, and we will end right up to the Reformation, although I'm not actually going to talk about the Reformation. The Reformation starts really after our time period and is a big enough topic that it's not worth me talking about for 5 minutes. There's a lot of good places you can go to listen to people talk about the Reformation who know more about it than I do. So let's breeze our way through really like 4 centuries of Christian history, again, starting right at the year 0. The main story, the main point that I want you to take away from today is how Christianity goes from a fringe house church practiced by a minority within another religious group, namely the Jews, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second, practiced in houses, often persecuted, illegal, a sort of underground cult, to being the official sanctioned church of the Roman Empire and the major religious force of the next more than 1,000 years, especially in Western Europe, but also in Byzantium and in Eastern Europe. If you remember, here's an image of Diocletian. If you don't remember this, you can go back and listen to Lecture 1, Section 1, Lecture 1. You can go back and review if you'd like to. We're going to get to exactly his role in this. One of the things that Diocletian is very much known for is persecution of the Christians, but he is not the first to do so. And part of this goes back to the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and the relationship between both of those and Roman state religion. Just briefly, the way that Roman state religion worked is that it really was a broad pantheon of different deities and particular religious practices. Rome was very, very willing to adopt new religious practices where they found them. So cults like Isis in Egypt were very quickly adapted and used not only in Egypt itself, but in other parts of the empire. And when Rome would conquer a new area, they would frequently say, okay, you've got this polytheistic religion here, and you've got a bunch of cult objects and different deities, and we have a couple of really important Roman gods, and we have the emperor who's kind of a god, and we'd like you to put idols to them up with the rest of them. Just, pray to them and do certain Roman state religious practices along with whatever you were already doing. And they are particularly not interested in largely disrupting the religion of some of the places that they take over. And in part because of that, Rome as an empire is religiously very polytheistic, very wide range of different types of cult practices and local religions that were tolerated by the Roman state. Judaism and monotheism, as we think of it generally, is an important exception to this. And one of the places where you really can get a taste of the Jewish exceptionalism is this book. This is an 11th century French medieval copy, but by this historian Flavius Josephus sometimes pronounced, who writes a history of the Jews. He himself is a Jew, but it's written in a Roman historiographic style. In particular, it describes the fall of Jerusalem, which I'll get to in just a second. Now, the reason that the Jews were an exception to this general Roman cult practice is that, of course, Jewish theology is very, very explicit about not having any idols, right? Even some of the famous kings, King Solomon, get in trouble for having too many wives and letting them bring in their own religious cult objects. It's actually explicit about this, about King Solomon in the Hebrew Bible. And of course, there's famous stories like the golden calf. And any time that somebody makes an idol or prays to a slightly different god, this causes problems within the Jewish community, right? There's one where they go around looking for who has idols in the camp because they've lost God's military favor as they're invading the Holy Land. So there's a number of stories that really drum home how important it is for Jews to pray not just to their God, right? Not one God amongst a selection or sort of buffet of idols, but rather that God exclusively. So when the Romans show up and they say, okay, here are the Roman cult gods, here's the emperor, you got to pray to them too, the Jews say, no way. That is absolutely forbidden in our religion. We cannot do that. And the Romans don't take too kindly to this, right? This is like the one thing that makes their religion not work is when you won't participate in Roman state religious ceremony. You can do whatever else you want, right? They don't mind if you add on all sorts of things that are not official doctrine of the Roman Empire. Totally fine. But to reject outright on theological grounds Roman state religion didn't fly very well. And so there's a consistent tension between Jewish practices and Roman practices. This results eventually, there's a Jewish uprising, there's a revolt, and this is all from Josephus's history. The war starts in the year 68 under the Emperor Nero, who's famous for a number of other things, but this is one of the things that happens during his reign. And eventually his successors, Vespasian and then Titus, suppress the Jewish revolts and they sack Jerusalem itself. And here is an image from the triumphal arch of Titus. The arch is made around 81. As you can see, the sack of Jerusalem is actually a few years earlier than that, 73. It's hard to make an arch like this overnight, obviously. And you can see in this little detail from the arch in the lower right, this is them carrying away the sacred objects of the Jewish temple, the candelabra in particular. And one of the things that Josephus describes is the Roman surprise when they get to the temple and they say, and they pull back the curtain and look into the holiest of holies, the inner sanctum of the Hebrew temple in Jerusalem, and say, wait a minute, there aren't even any gods here. There are no images. There are no idols. That this religion is a joke or is not understandable to this Roman cult system in which a multiplicity of idols is the norm. Now, Jewish revolts don't end with that, obviously. They try to put down these revolts by removing Jewish direct control over Jerusalem, but they continue. There's another uprising and war in 130. The Emperor Hadrian bans circumcision, tries to prevent Jews from living in Jerusalem at all, right? So the tensions don't go away even after this commemorated and very high-profile sacking of a revolt in the city of Jerusalem itself. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. We'll step back. Obviously, Christianity has appeared in 68. Christianity has already officially appeared in one capacity or another, although what it looks like is quite amorphous and hard to pin down in the year 68. Jesus and the story surrounding Jesus happens when the Jews are still in control of Jerusalem, but are themselves full of theological disputes. And actually, this is part of the reason for some of the revolts, is that the Jewish position is not comfortable within the Roman Empire, right? They're not certain of where they stand. So there are a lot of disputes within the Jewish hierarchy. And when Jesus mentions groups like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, these are different political religious groups with their own ideas about how Jews should relate to the Romans, right? Should open revolt be practiced to keep an independent Jewish state? Should they allow for continuing Roman control, but just keep control of the cult at the temple? What place does the temple hold in Jewish life, right? As there are more Jews outside of Israel and traveling through the empire, what is the importance of the cult at that site of the temple versus other Jewish rituals that are performed in the home? And that debate, frankly, continues for centuries, particularly after the temple is destroyed by the Romans, right? Then what do all of those other rituals mean? What is the role of Jewish practice in the absence of temple theology. Now, in those first 50, 60 years of Christianity, it's based on, as I mentioned, little house churches, very isolated and very disorganized and highly messianic. There are other early texts. You may have heard of things like the Gnostic Gospels or other early books of Christian theology that present very different ideas of what it means to be Christian than in the New Testament Bible as we have it consolidated today. The high degree of messianic attitude means that a lot of them are aiming at living a perfect life as quickly as possible, because in the narrative about Jesus, after he is crucified, resurrected, goes up to heaven, he is coming back any day now, right? It is built into that story that you should be watching because it could happen imminently. So for at least these first few decades, there's a sense that this could happen at any time and people need to be ready. And it's worth noting that some of the religious split and debate within the Jews, there are a lot of Messianic Jews as well. There are other Jews who think that Jesus was not the Messiah, but that the Messiah, in fact, is coming. And the Jewish messianism actually is given a boost by the sacking of Jerusalem, because it is part of the narrative of the Hebrew Bible that there are often prophets sent to the Jews in times of exile to restore the centrality of the Jewish temple rite. So they are looking for a king to deliver the Jews from bondage. They are looking for a Messiah figure just as much after the destruction of the temple as before. The early Christian church, and this is really the crux of this issue, the early Christian church to the Romans looks like another sect of Judaism, right? There are sects that believe in the coming of the Messiah. This is just one other sect that happens to think that the Messiah was this guy, Jesus, of Nazareth, who had already been executed, resurrected, and gone up to heaven. So the difference between that theology and some of the other Jewish messianic ideas in the first century to the Romans is pretty indistinct. So early Roman persecution of Christianity, they basically see it as persecution of Judaism in the same way. These are people who are likely to revolt. They do not approve of Roman state religion. They are unwilling to practice it. They tend to be radicals. And so from the perspective of the Roman state, there really is no difference between early Christianity and Judaism. By the end of the first century and into the second century, so from the year 70 after the sack of Jerusalem and moving forward for the next 50 years, one of the things that really changes in Christianity is a move towards preaching not to Jews generally, but to Gentiles and Greeks. And you see this already with people like Paul and the Pauline letters that are part of the New Testament now, where there are letters to groups of people that are not just Jews, right? This Messiah is for everybody. And that choice within Christianity didn't have to be that way, right? There were Christians who thought that the Messiah was only for Jews. So you had to have been a Jew earlier. But it is this strand of Christianity that preaches to people outside of the Jewish community that eventually wins out and becomes the dominant theology of Christianity, which, looking back on it now is pretty obvious, right? But at the time, this was not entirely clear. And one of the most notable early writers in this regard is a person named Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr takes very seriously the Pauline version of Christian teachings, and in part because of this constant confusion between radical Judaism and early Christianity, he is at pains to show just how different these are. And he is so vociferous in arguing about how different Christianity and Judaism are. One of the things he writes is he writes to an emperor to try to get him to stop persecuting Christians, and he tries to describe how Christians are not like Jews. Go ahead and keep persecuting Jews, he says, because we are not like them. We are a new group. We are preaching to everyone. Here are the good things that Christianity is doing. And in doing so, one of the things that he says is he prefigures Christianity in some of the writings of people like Plato and Aristotle and other Greek thinkers. So even at this very early date, there is a move within Christianity to resuscitate classical authors that are well respected as acceptable to the Christian canon. And we will come back to this several times, but just stick that away in the back of your mind for the moment because it's important. The other thing about Justin Martyr is that because he is so vociferous in distinguishing Christians from Jews, he comes off as very aggressive and, in retrospect, fairly anti-Semitic. But it's worth remembering that we're looking at him through a very long lens of Jewish persecution by Christians. And that dynamic didn't exist in the first century and the second century in the same way. for just one example, one of the things that he argues when he's arguing with the Romans to get them to stop persecuting Christians is that he said he is one of the first people to articulate Jewish guilt for the death of Jesus. He says that was the Jews' fault. It's not the Romans' fault. We don't have anything against the Romans. The New Testament itself is mixed on this, and there's a whole tangent that we could go into about arguments about Jewish deicide. But suffice to say, he is not the last person to say that the Jews are responsible for killing Christ. It's an argument that you find in John Chrysostom, who's an incredibly important writer in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He's writing in Constantinople a couple centuries later. Tertullian, who is another fairly early Christian writer. He's writing in North Africa, but still after Justin Martyr. Ultimately, those arguments are repudiated formally by the Catholic Church at the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. So it is an option within Christian thought, although it is not necessarily the dominant one. Augustine actually has a different version of Jews as witnesses to the death of Christ that I would say is sort of the mainstream of Catholic thought. But the Jews as killers of Christ is something that routinely appears throughout Catholic history. And Justin Martyr is one of the first most notable people to articulate that, although again, it's hard to see the way he was thinking without this lens of 1,000 years of persecution of Jews by Christians. So, to go back to one more point about what this early church looked like, the people who were attracted to these house churches and the early Christian message of the messianic coming of Christ, it attracts largely the disaffected. Many of the people are not those who are in power in Roman circles. They are certainly not the leadership of Rome in any way, certainly at the beginning. It attracts people who are often down and out or at the fringes of society. This is probably part of the reason that as it starts out, it is very popular among women. And the early church seems to have been often led by women. There was a more radical equality among priests of the early church. And there were leaders of all sorts, different ethnic groups, but particularly the gender split was very, very different than the incredibly masculine-centric Roman state religion had been. There are early gospels. There are gospels of Mary. There is a gospel of Mary Magdalene. None of these appear in the final New Testament, the consolidated books of the New Testament. But early on, women's voices in Christian belief and even the articulation of stories about the life of Christ were more present. This centrality and belief amongst Roman women, I will come back to in just a minute. But first, we're going to go back to this guy, who I already brought up at the very beginning, but here again is Diocletian. And if you remember, we talked about Diocletian's political reform of the empire, but one of the things that he does is he really reinforces the imperial cult, which leads to new persecutions against Christians, especially 303 to 310. And we talked about Diocletian before. You remember the period before him is totally politically dysfunctional. There are all sorts of emperors who are getting knocked off by their own generals. The generals appoint an emperor, they're knocked off by another general. It happens repeatedly in the 3rd century. So this period from sort of 250 to 300 is sometimes called the Little Peace by Christians because there's too much political dysfunction in Rome to actually go after the Christians in any sort of particular way. But some of the earlier persecutions, right? I mentioned Nero. There are sort of fantastic stories about him obviously feeding Christians to lions is one of the classic ones, but, dipping them in tar and lighting them on fire to use as torches to illuminate gladiatorial fights, crazy things like that. They also have sort of weird stories about Christianity that help to fire the persecutions, right? There are stories of orgies at their rituals or eating babies, which ironically is something that the Christians eventually level as a charge against Jews later on. We'll get there eventually. But there are these criticisms that are probably not on the whole true, but Roman persecution of Christians is, of course, very real. Diocletian persecutes them heavily, especially near the end of his reign, 303, 304, 305. And this is actually, as I said, directly associated with new Roman political stability and a re-expression of Roman political power. Now, it's Diocletian's successor who is one of the most important in terms of Christian history. I'm just going to review very briefly. If you remember, part of what Diocletian does is the tetrarchate, right? The 4 rulers. There's supposed to be 2 Augustuses and 2 Caesars, one in the east, one in the west. in Rome and in Constantinople. So in 285, Diocletian and Maximian are the emperors in the east and west, respectively. In 293, Constantius, who is the emperor Constantine's father, is the Caesar in the west, and Galerius is the Caesar in the east. Now in 305, after 20 years, there's supposed to be this double retirement, and the Caesars move up to become the Augustuses, and they appoint new Caesars. And so in 305, Maximinus, who is the nephew of Galerius, you don't have to keep all of these straight, but I'm just going to lay them out there just in case. Galerius, who is the Caesar in the east, his nephew Maximinus becomes the new Caesar, and Severus, who is an old military companion, becomes the Caesar in the west. Now, only a year later in 306, Constantinius, the father of Constantine, dies as Augustus, and Severus moves up into the role of Augustus. But the troops declare for Constantine, right? Constantine is still a military leader. He's one of these generals. This is the sort of thing that has happened before. The troops say, actually, we don't want Severus to be the leader here. We want Constantine. And so Galerius makes Constantine the new Caesar. Now Maxentius, who is the son of Maximian, revolts to this. Now, because you can see, right, there are appointments of nephews and family relations, right? The family dynasty thing is not something Diocletian could entirely escape from, although I think in part the new appointment of the Caesars was meant to do exactly that. Maxentius, who's the son of Maximian, right? Maximian was one of the co-Augustuses with Diocletian, so going all the way back there, he revolts because he has now been left out of all of these new appointments of Caesars who will eventually become Augustuses. Maximinus, the nephew of Galerius, one of the newly appointed Caesars, is sent in to get a pact between Maximinus and Maxentius so that this revolt will end. This is in 306. Then in 307, the senior emperor, who is still Galerius, right? Galerius is still the person who was one of the Augustuses under Diocletian and Maximian in the original tetrarchate. Galerius sends an army to put down the revolt of Maxentius, who he considers a usurper. He wants the succession to work the way Diocletian designed it, and it is not. But before the army gets there, it defects to Maxentius, and the leaders are killed. You have basically the beginnings of a civil war between Maxentius, who sees himself as a successor of Maximian, and Constantine, the successor to Constantinus, and Maximinus, the nephew of Galerius, who are all jockeying to be Caesar and eventually Augustus. They attempt to come to some sort of agreement in 310 by promoting Maximian and demoting Constantine, who is unhappy about that, obviously. But Maximian, the old emperor, right, the father of Maxentius, rebels against Constantine in the west, but he is defeated and commits suicide. So his son takes up the battle and rebels for 2 more years. So this battle between, break it down, the part you really need to know is this persistent battle between Constantine, the son of Constantinius, one of the original tetrarchate, and Maximian, son of Maxentius, also one of the original tetrarchate, are fighting this protracted battle about who gets to be next in line of succession. This is part of the problem when you have 4 people who are all supposed to run things, is that they all have kids who then all expect to run things. Obviously, this isn't the last time that happens. Now, what really matters in all of this is how Constantine brings the conflict to an end at the Battle of Milvian Bridge on the 28th of October in 312. And here is a pretty famous image of it from 1520. The fact that they are still painting images of the Battle of Milvian Bridge should tell you something. At the Battle of Milvian Bridge, there are various interpretations. This appears in a number of different chronicles. It appears pretty early in Eusebius, but then you see it in other places with other sorts of interpretations. Constantine has a dream before the battle. He sees the Chi-Rho over the sun and hears the words, "In hoc signo vinces." With this sign or under this sign, you will conquer. Conquer by this is how it's sometimes translated. It doesn't say exactly in Eusebius if this is a Latin cross or the image of the Chi-Rho. The Chi-Rho are the first 2 letters of Christ's name. It was a pretty important early Christian symbol. But anyway, it's generally assumed to be some sort of Christian imagery. It becomes a cross in most later image paintings like the one I'm showing you here. It's one of these early stories of the Christian God's support for the victory, not Constantine, right? Constantine conquers because he believes in God, and it sets up a trope for how battles are won with God's help, something that already exists in the Old Testament, but this is one of the first major Christian uses of that narrative. Now, Constantine routs the forces of Maxentius. The escaping army suffers terribly. Maxentius himself drowns in the Tiber trying to flee. Shortly thereafter, when Constantine is the undisputed emperor in the West, he signs the Edict of Milan in 313 and legalizes Christianity for the empire, right? And this is part of Eusebius's narrative, is that the Battle of Milvian Bridge, he is convinced of the virtuousness of Christianity and makes it legal for the rest of the empire. People can now worship Christian beliefs and Christian liturgy without interference from the Roman state. It is worth noting that Constantine himself does not actually convert to Christianity and is not baptized until very late in his life in 337. Just to make this point extra clear, right? Like the triumphal arch that we saw before about the sack of Jerusalem, this is Constantine's triumphal arch commemorating that same Battle of Milvian Bridge. And this detail in the lower right shows the image of that battle. There are no crosses or kairos on the shield. This is a very Roman state triumphal arch, very much in the tradition of Titus, as we saw before. This is probably the official Roman version in 315, although Constantine's conversion is something that happens later in his life and fits this Christian story that Eusebius is telling. All of this brings us back to one of the aspects that I said would be important in this lecture, which is the role of women in early Christianity. Because one of the notable Christians in Constantine's life is his mother. And the existence of a mother figure in a high-profile conversion story is something that does not leave Christian rhetoric for centuries after this. His mother's name is Helena. She apparently was already Christian sometime prior to 306, possibly from early on in her life. We don't really know. As I mentioned, Christianity was routinely more popular amongst women in the Roman Empire because of their relatively more prominent position in the Christian hierarchy rather than in the Roman hierarchy. Constantine's mother is repudiated by his father, Constantius, in 289. However, she remains fairly close to Constantine himself throughout her life. He doubtless had already had relatively positive experiences of Christianity from her influence, even before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, certainly before his own conversion. And as I said, he doesn't convert until very late anyway. Possibly that is because of lingering conflicts in himself between Roman state religion and Christianity, that as long as he is a major figure of the Roman state, outright conversion was too much. Although it's more clear to see how he might have made it legal for practice, especially knowing that this is something his mother believed in. This gives an image of a man who's probably strongly influenced by the faith of his mother, but prefers to act politically Roman in his position of power, refusing what he may have seen as a female influence of Christianity, right? This is not a misnomer about how early Christianity works. To add to this, there are several other stories about prominent women in early Christianity, especially in this 4th century after the conversion of Constantine. One of the earliest forms of intellectual writing that we have by any woman in Western culture is a woman named Egerdia, who writes an itinerary of her trip from Jerusalem to the Holy Land with specific mentions of visiting all sorts of Old Testament sites. She comes from Gaul. She comes from a Roman family, again, not unlike Helena herself, right? Somebody who finds faith in Christianity but comes from a Roman background, but is a woman in an otherwise well-connected Roman family. We also know that the itinerary seems to be part of a letter that she writes back to a circle of other women, presumably literate, presumably reasonably well-connected and well-educated, right? So Roman women believing in Christianity, one of them, Egerdia, travels to Jerusalem and writes back a narrative of her trip. And just to read you a quick excerpt so you can get a sense of this, she describes the liturgy, the Christian liturgy in Jerusalem, and this is in the year 385. At cockcrow, the Anastasia is opened, monks, nuns, and lay people entering, singing refrains to hymns, psalms, and antiphons. As soon as dawn comes, they start the morning hymns. The bishop, who is in fact Cyril of Jerusalem, and his clergy join them. The bishop first enters the cave of the sepulchre and inside speaks the prayers for the catechumens and the faithful, and then emerges to bless everyone. At midday, another service with psalms and antiphons, the bishop joining them, and again entering the cave of the sepulchre takes place. Another service takes place at 3 o'clock, a further one at 4. The Linknicon, or Lucernare, at which the great glass lanterns and many candles at both the Anastasis and Golgotha are lit from a single light brought forth from within the sepulchre. That ceremony goes back to Judaism's blessings of the candles by the women of the household on Sabbath Eve. On Sunday, these ceremonies are carried out more elaborately, adding to them much sensing, with the bishop reading the gospel accounts of the resurrection from within the screen of the cave to the sepulchre, and presbyters preaching so that the people will continually be learning about the Bible and the love of God. So you can see in this letter her fascination with the liturgy that happens at the tomb of Christ, right, on the Mount of Golgotha, her connection to that with earlier Jewish liturgy, which is not gone, although obviously Christianity by this point has superseded a lot of its Jewish roots, but the sense of influence of Judaism is not gone. But also that by 385, and now we're well into the 4th century, right, the Christian hierarchy of priests and a liturgy that speaks to lay people through priests and bishops and to some extent monks is already pretty well in place. Another example we might throw in that I'm not going to go into, but there are a lot of these, are early virgin martyr stories. There are lots and lots of them, and they are really fascinating. And if you need a primary source, you're interested in a primary source of that sort, let me know. There are tons to choose from, and they are quite astonishing in how different they are in terms of how we often think of later Christianity. So that's another example of sort of the prominence of women continuing in Christianity, even into the 4th century, as it becomes Roman state religion and the general power of Christianity increases, and we start to get some of the patristic writers, really important male theologians of the early church. So back to Helena briefly, and then on to other important mothers in the early Christian narrative. Now, the image I just showed you is Saint Helena showing Constantine the true cross from 1622, right? So the sense of Helena being somebody important in bringing the Christian message to Constantine himself is something that is still depicted and known in the 15th and 16th century, right? All the way at the other end of our time period. Helena herself is accorded all sorts of miracles. These are from woodcuts in 1453, and these three in particular I like. She purportedly goes on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and visits the holy places, and in Bethlehem she finds Mary's tunic, which becomes an object of devotion. She founds her own church in Bethlehem, and I like the image of her. It's sort of a classic, like, see, here's my church. She also purportedly discovers the tombs of the three kings, their bodies, and you can see her here with the three caskets, and brings them to Constantinople, where they become major saint shrines to the three kings until they are stolen in the Fourth Crusade in 1204, but that's a different story. One of the things that really changes after 313, when Christianity is made legal, is that in coming out of the shadows, right, in coming out from under persecution, there is a huge flowering of the amount of Christian writing and Christian theology. In 325, the First Council of Nicaea, a major council, is held where a lot of the core tenets of Catholicism are hammered out. I will talk more about Arianism next time, but it is at the Council of Nicaea that they present all of the arguments against Arianism, decide that it is formally a heresy, and condemn it. It is where the what is currently called the Nicene Creed, the basic tenets of Christian belief, are hammered out, what it means to be an Orthodox Christian, right? So Christianity now has enough power and confidence in itself to declare who is a Christian and who is not a Christian, who is not an appropriate Christian. The Arians are on one side of that. As I said, I'll talk a little bit more about that next time. Along with this new certainty and consolidation of belief, you get a whole bunch of really famous theological writers. Now, the church fathers, as they're often called, and note that these are often men, there are already some in early centuries. I already mentioned Tertullian, who is at least a century before this, and Justin Martyr, who is a couple centuries back. So there are earlier writers, but the 4th century, we have a whole bunch of them, and many of the most important people moving forward. Just to give you some names, a couple images. Here's St. Ambrose, again, a painting from the mid-14th century. All of these images are much, much later but this is part of the influence of these people. St. Ambrose, who is the Bishop of Milan, who is purported to have written any number of famous hymns. He is purported to be a great preacher. Here he is pardoning the Emperor Theodosius, right? So we have an image of an emperor subservient to, in this case, a mere bishop. Ambrose himself is never pope, but he has other theological writings that are also quite important. Perhaps the single most important person to come out of this 4th century expansion of Christian thought is St. Augustine. And it's hard to underestimate just how important St. Augustine is. He writes a lot, tons and tons of sermons and letters and writings against the Donatists in North Africa, who were another heretical group in the 4th century. And one of the most important things about Augustine is that he's incredibly well steeped in Greek and Roman philosophy. He's very, very well educated. He's the son of a relatively important Roman patrician class. So he gets the best in Greco-Roman education. He knows Aristotle and Plato very well. One of the things that he writes, and this is from one of his more famous books, the Confessions, is about how he goes through all of these different sources, how he looks at Manichaeanism, how he looks at Neoplatonism and other teachings of Greco-Roman philosophy and finds them all lacking, finds them all sort of intellectual games, until he finally comes to Christianity, where he finds sort of his true calling and eventually becomes bishop in Hippo, which is a city in North Africa. It's roughly near the border of modern day Tunis and Algeria. But he also consolidates a lot of Christian doctrine. He writes against the Donatists as well as the Arians. Like I said, I will get into the heresies a bit more next time when we talk about barbarian conversion. But he takes a lot of Greco-Roman thought and describes how it really fits within the system of Christianity, right? So he's both creating foundational thought for later Christian theology, but also according it with Greco-Roman tradition, as I described Justin Martyr doing before him. And it's Augustine who really, this is not a certain point, right? Other writers, and Origen would be a good example, who's writing in Alexandria, I believe. Origen is a much less well-known person, but he is criticized occasionally by other writers for mixing too much Greek and Jewish Neoplatonic thought into his Christian theology. So it's never a certain thing that the Greco-Roman tradition will make its way into the Christian tradition. And they argue that out more than once in Christian history. However, Augustine, exactly like Constantine, has an already Christian mother. And here he is painted very piously into the 19th century. This is 1855 on the right, with his mother, Saint Monica. She herself is a saint, and a lot of the importance of her sainthood is just making sure that Augustine becomes Christian and writes everything that Augustine writes. Like Constantine, Monica, his mother, Saint Monica, is married to a pagan, a Roman pagan man, married to a Christian woman, and they are constantly in conflict about baptism of their children, family practice, rites, and eventually they also split. We don't know the specific conditions of Constantius's split with Constantine's mother and how much that was about Christianity, but that does seem to have been an issue between Augustine's father and his mother, Monica. Now, Monica appears frequently in Augustine's writing. He writes very glowingly about her, how she constantly prays for him, and it is actually under Monica where she takes him eventually to hear the preaching of St. Ambrose, who I just mentioned a moment ago. And it is part of the efficacy of St. Ambrose's teachings that eventually converts Augustine. And here you have an image, again, from the 16th century. Now, the last church father that I want to mention before I wrap up for today and prep you for next time is St. Jerome. And St. Jerome is a big deal. If Augustine is the main writer who consolidates a lot of Christian thought and sets the tone for how theology will be done for the next millennia and a half, basically, and people like Ambrose are important for Christian preaching and reaching out with their message and conversion, Jerome is important because he is the early translator of the Bible. The Bible by this point has come to take on its modern form. It has the Old and New Testaments. It has the four Gospels that we think of in the modern Bible. St. Jerome is the main translator of the Bible into Latin. Now, there have been other translations. There was an old Latin translation of what we call the Septuagint, which is the Greek Bible. It literally means the 70, but it's the collection of the Greek New Testament texts with the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. Jerome, using both Hebrew and the Septuagint and other available texts of the Bible, creates what becomes the definitive Latin version of the Bible, what we refer to now as the Vulgate. And it's interesting because he's a very good translator. He knows that there are different ways to render these things and different ways to create phrases. So he actually has, one of the great examples is there are two books of Psalms in the Vulgate. And they're the same book of the Psalms, but one is a translation from the Septuagint, from Greek, using a more of a Greco-Roman classical poetic style and word order, and another one that is directly from Hebrew that tries to maintain some of the idiosyncrasies of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew word order. He translates them both to try to get different flavors of the book of Psalms, right? He's not pretending, it hasn't become the canonical sort of Latin Bible that it will be later. He's creating it. He's aware that this already exists in different languages and how translation interacts. And so is in some ways a very sensitive creator of this text in Latin. So in part because of the quality of it, this becomes the text, the Latin text that people learn in monasteries, that is recited throughout most of Western Europe. Again, until Vatican II, which I mentioned earlier, says that you were allowed to do the liturgy not in Latin, but in vernacular languages. And Jerome, not unlike Augustine and Constantine, has women who influence the direction of his Christianity, right? The appearance of Christian women in the 4th century is still persistent, in part because of their important position within the Christian church before that. So here on the right, you have him painted with St. Paula and St. Eustachium, again, a painting from the 17th century. We don't actually know very much about them because a lot of what we know comes from Jerome's own letters, but they seem to have traveled from Rome to Jerusalem to provide assistance to Jerome specifically in his work of translation. Jerome says of St. Paula, "Her zeal was wonderful, her courage scarcely credible for a woman. Forgetful of her sex and the weakness of her frame, she desired to dwell with her maidens among so many thousands of monks in the Egyptian Thebaid, but returned to Jerusalem." So the image of women from Rome with new Christian freedoms in the 4th century, of a sort, right? And you can see that again, we're talking about the second half of the 4th century when Christianity has been legalized and made eventually the state religion of Rome itself. With these new Christian liberties, sets out to aid in this growth of Christian practice and liturgy. But it turns out that this is still a stronger expression than Roman men are used to from women. And I think this quote from Jerome illustrates that really well, right? Her courage scarcely credible for a woman, forgetful of the weakness of her frame. That Roman attitudes about male and female gender roles are to some extent undermined by the appearance of Christianity. And this is something that is consciously emulated by later women. We might think of Bridget of Sweden or Marjorie Kemp in England, who the quote, weakness of their sex is something that Christianity actually ameliorates. So, quick review. We've gone from house churches, a radical subgroup, messianic group within Judaism that eventually distinguishes itself from Judaism, but still suffers under persecution of the Romans, who don't particularly see them as different and isn't interested in seeing them as particularly different, to a church in the late 3rd century that is beginning to find more and more adherents, especially amongst Roman women, because it gives more of a role to women than the Roman more patriarchal society, particularly in leadership and cult practice. And then we have this legendary Battle of Milvian Bridge where Constantine ostensibly converts, although as we see it, some of that is the influence of his mother, who is absolutely one of these Roman women converted to Christianity. He makes Christianity first legal, then later on it becomes the official religion of Rome. In the 4th century, after that has happened, you get a huge explosion of new Christian thought and theology. Part of that is letting a bunch of heresies out of the can that Christianity now has enough control to start declaring some people heretics, but we're going to talk about that a lot more next time. And you get a bunch of new, really famous patristic church father theologian writers in the second half of the 4th and into the 5th century. People like Jerome, Augustine, Ambrose. Now, next time we're going to talk about not the conversion of Rome, but the conversion of barbarian groups. And I will give a little bit of backstory about heresies, because that's a pretty important component of the conversion of the barbarians. We will talk about Arian kingdoms in France. We will talk about the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons by Gregory the Great and Augustine of Canterbury, and at least mention the way that the conversion of Constantine by his mother, and then having converted the ruler, you would then allow the people to practice their religion freely and eventually make it the official state religion, creates a narrative that can be followed for how to convert a people. And this will color the conversion of people over the next several hundred years. So that's next time.